20 травня.
It's May 20, Ukraine Media Center open from continues its operation. My name is Petrenko, and now we will have a presentation of the report called Ukrainian Peace Plan as a basis for preserving the global world order. Joining us in our studio are Anton Kuchukhidze, co-founder of United Ukraine think tank, international political scientist, Petro Oleshchuk, political expert, PhD in political sciences, Valentyn Gladkykh, political analyst, PhD in philosophical sciences, and Dmytro Levus, foreign policy expert. Good afternoon, dear gentlemen. So now there's a lot of talks about what the final peace plan will be looking like, how should we end the war, and different parties suggest different options. So Mr. Petro, first of all, I would like to ask you, there are so-called Istanbul agreements, they exist for a long time, and Vladimir Putin appeals to them, talking about the future peace plan. In your opinion, to what extent these Istanbul agreements may serve as a foundation for the peace plan developed by Ukraine, and what is the risk of its implementation? Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to know that the scarecrow of those Istanbul agreements was taken out of the cabinet when the news emerged about the preparation of the peace summit in Switzerland. It's a political technology which is being widely practiced by Russia. When you need to juxtapose something from the information space, you start throwing in some alternatives, and the more alternatives, the better, to create the impression that there's a lot of some alternatives, incredible lot of alternatives. So they work on this topic for the last 2 months, and to develop it, they did not only engage the opinion leaders and speakers working with Western audience, but they've also threw it in through 2 sources in American and German press, that direct text of those Istanbul agreements, or at least some drafts. Well, because the actual texts were never approved, but a lot of parts of the plan should have been agreed upon further on. So it was only one of the optional drafts. So what is the manipulation around those Istanbul agreements? The manipulation is being pushed by the Russian opinion leaders, and they say that is as if the Istanbul agreements mean the end of the war, and reverting back to this stance of the year 2022 before the 24th of February. But if we look through that article of Bild, it clearly says that those Istanbul agreements contemplate the extra bloc status of Ukraine and restriction of Ukrainian sovereignty. Well, for example, Finland and Sweden had an extra bloc status before, but they were cooperating with NATO. Well, all of such things, all of such joint, trainings, joint military exercises, location of foreign troops in the territory of Ukraine were severely restricted under those Istanbul agreements. But based on current conditions, we understand that such restrictions, they would mean complete disarmament of Ukraine, and we all clearly understand what consequences may the disarmament mean under the strict extra bloc status. In fact, the Russians were trying to put Ukraine under the condition of binary logic, when on one hand you undertake some obligations, and if you comply with it, you get captured, and if you do not comply with your obligations, you create the preconditions for reestablishing those agreements by military intervention. So the articulation of all those agreements is absolutely absurd. I'm not even talking about any territorial issues and legalization of Russian occupation of certain parts of Ukraine. I'm just talking about the content of the agreements, that they are of manipulative nature, and those agreements had no prospects of being implemented. There would be no mechanisms for control and ensuring of their functioning. And based on that, I'm making quite a simple conclusion that basically the statement about the existence of those Istanbul agreements that are not actual for the time being, and everybody clearly understands it, is just another way of manipulation by Russia in the context of influence or rendering less effective the conference in Switzerland, making everybody start discussing some absolutely contentless things, and to once again demonstrate their peacemaking claim. It's important for them because for a large number of economic partners of Ukraine, they don't understand why Russia is still waging this war, which results in growth of prices on food, on oil, and so on and so forth. So for Russians, it's important to maintain the initiative and to keep saying, like, look, we're ready to end the war tomorrow, even tomorrow. We had those Istanbul agreements, we're peacekeepers, we're peacemakers, and Ukraine doesn't want to end the war. And it's clear that to do that, they try to promote all their plans, and based on the scale of coverage, the scale of publications, number of people engaged in promoting all those agreements, we may more or less precisely observe the scale of Russian influence in the global information space. This is pretty much it about the Istanbul agreements, what I wanted to say, and the attempts to reboard them within the last couple of months. Well, thank you, Mr. Petro. Ukraine has our own formula of peace, which has been actively promoted by us. So, Mr. Volodymyr, in your opinion, what is the potential of Ukrainian peace formula? What are the weak sides and what are the risks around it? Well, we have to realize that, in fact, if we read through the Ukrainian formula of peace, in the majority of provisions, the name Ukraine or the adjective Ukrainian are not used, and President Zelensky keeps saying that it's a formula that can potentially become universal formula for settlement of any existing and potential conflicts. And those provisions contained in this formula, they are not only present for Ukraine, they are actual on a global level. For example, food security. It's not only about Ukraine, or for example, nuclear security, energy security. Is it only about Ukraine, or are we talking about some global fundamentals based on which the world order should function upon, and respect to territorial integrity and sovereignty? So nothing there is in contradiction to the United Nations statute. We understand that it's all about the international law. The only thing that Ukraine requires is the reestablishment of civilized principles of coexistence that were so brutally violated by Russian Federation. And in reality, it would be just great to have this peace formula to be approved as an ultimatum by the United Nations organization, and it would result in demonstration of meaning of United Nations organization in the system of international relations. But we understand that it's impossible because Russia, the aggressor country, whose leader, the self-proclaimed president, and who has an arrest warrant issued in his name, is a part of Security Council of the United Nations with a veto right. So I think that here we come to the necessity of establishing some alternative platform, and I think that this peace summit will be one of the biggest events in international arena, at least this year, and not only for Ukraine. I mean, for me personally, this discussion whether China will or will not be present there it doesn't have a meaning for us, it has a meaning for China. If China wants some role and a place in the system of international relations, they cannot abstain from taking part in this conference. It doesn't necessarily mean that they should play some constructive role, but in fact their absence will mean that they withdraw from solution of the most painful problem currently existing at the global level, because we're not talking only about Ukrainian interests there. So again, we have to realize that any other formulas which really do exist, first of all, we have to ask ourselves whether such formulas can be implemented, because Russians and many skeptics, they keep saying that it's problematic to implement this formula, and I can say with all possible responsibility that other formulas are equally problematic in terms of their implementation. However, the consequences of implementation of this or other formula will be diametrically opposing and different. So why should we take those titanic efforts to implement a formula that would entail some catastrophic consequences for global world order? So I think that it's better to take the same efforts, but to implement the Ukrainian formula of peace, which would be laid as a foundation for civilized coexistence all around the world. And another nuance, when we talk about Istanbul agreements, the Russians who try to promote them, they forget mentioning that they did not become agreements, they were drafts. The parties did not achieve any agreements that on some topics that were discussed, at least from what we can judge from the information that was published, like those security guarantees, whether they will have the right of veto, as Russia was saying. There were discussions about the amount of material, amount of personnel in the ranks of Ukrainian armed forces, and when Russians say that everything was agreed upon, they lie. Mr. Petro mentioned it quite correctly that such provisions could never have been implemented. So to summarize it, it makes no sense mentioning other provisions of the Ukrainian formula of peace by Volodymyr Zelensky, because I think that everybody knows it. I just want to emphasize once again that this peace formula is not of discrimination nature towards third countries. We cannot say that Ukraine is trying to protect its interests and at the same time it would impede the security of other countries. This peace formula doesn't have anything that would be in contradiction with international law and the United Nations Statute. Everything is built upon them, quite on contrary. And on top of that, this Global Peace Summit can become a first step potential for establishment of alternative organizations, alternative to the United Nations organization, which in this situation is unfortunately incapable of fulfilling some important functions. I cannot say that they don't do anything or cannot do anything. Well, basically UNESCO or UNICEF are parts of the United Nations. They can protect big cats, different flora, but again, other problems that arise in the world currently, they are unable to react to. So I think that today the future depends on the results of this peace summit and to what extent the civilized world will be ready to support this formula and to use it as a foundation for further settlement of conflict. And the last thing I would like to mention to clear things a little bit up, I'm hearing something from even Ukrainian experts that nothing can happen without participation of Russia, but people do not understand that the goal of this summit is to make sure that those provisions of the peace formula should be demanded to be complied with by Russia, not by Ukraine, but all of the civilized world. For me, it's not a Yalta conference, it's Tehran 43, it's the post-war settlement. It doesn't mean that after the summit in Switzerland the war ends, Putin gives up. No, it will contemplate the complicated process of implementation of those agreements. I just hope that those agreements will be achieved and Russia will receive yet another signal that their bold attempts to ruin the global world order and its foundations failed and they will not be implemented efficiently. Thank you very much, Mr. Anton. Mr. Valentyn mentioned United Nations Statute a number of times. So the question to you is, why is it important for Ukraine to make this peace formula so universal, so compliant with all of the European civilized standards? Why is it important to adhere to those standards, including United Nations standards? Well, in brief, compliance with the international standards and laws ensures continuous support for Ukraine. As it was mentioned by the representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Office of Ukraine and other top-level officials, is that peace plan of Ukraine is in compliance with the principles of the United Nations Organization Statute. That's a general phrase, but it's quite powerful. You know, the modern world order, no matter how non-perfect it is, it's based on the status of United Nations Organization, and it contemplates a number of important things. They are, again, generalized, but very important. So first of all, the peace plan of Ukraine reflects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And the Statute of United Nations in the year 1945 approved that the parties to international relations refrain from war as a way of exercising policy, and it's prohibited to violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. So this is the direct relation to this generalized phrase. And now tell me, please, who is going to dispute the United Nations statute? In fact, the peace plan of Ukraine is the reminder to everybody what are the rules the world should live under now. And you know, it's not our wishful thinking, like we decided to do so we're gonna do this. No, everything is supported by the international law provisions, and this peace plan was actually endorsed by more than 80 civilized countries of the world, and non-finalized position of China during at least one working meeting where the peace plan was discussed. The Chinese representatives were present. I think that it was a result of Saudi influence. I'm not sure about that, but nevertheless, even despite the fact that on the 24th of February 2023 they presented their peace plan. And another factor, Ukraine ensures its right for collective self-defense. If we build something on our own on a diplomatic level, you understand, well, the international relations, specifically when we talk about relations with Russia's Federation, you know, they have different levels of attempts. We had to balance, and we've used this collective mechanism of diplomatic representation and promotion of our peace plan. When you invent a mechanism that only you can understand, it's not gonna fly. But when you establish it based on the general standards approved on the level of the international legislation, it gives you a chance. Well, you know, I'm not wearing the pink glasses, I'm not idealist, but in order to get support, Ukraine uses these rhetorics, and we add those things as a part of our peace plan, because, you know, should it be for such rhetorics that we've proclaimed independence and we think our territory is such, well, some might have supported it. Yeah, there was an international recognition of the borders in 1991, but when you maintain yourself on a structural level with fundamental provisions of the international law, it opens certain opportunities for you. Basically, you don't have to waste time and continue talking about the Act of Independence of Ukraine or about the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine about the Ukrainian sovereignty. We all understand what we're talking about here. And yet another important principle that is implemented by Ukrainian peace plan is the fact that there is the provision of the UN statute that the parties in bilateral and multilateral relations, they assume diplomatic way of solution of problems as a main way of solving problems. And if you recall that period when this peace plan was born, it's important again to recall such an important thing. Mr. Petro has mentioned it correctly. Everything's going on around Istanbul agreements, but there was a small period of time when the Russians in the Western media, well, we could see it with the naked eye. They were promoting the statement that it was Ukraine who undermined the peace process, and it's Ukraine who see the armed way of solutions. So the peace plan by President Zelensky is another initiative victory in terms of diplomatic way of solution. And if you recall the final version of the presentation, it was happening during the summit of G19 in the year 22. And since the beginning, this peace plan was more powerful than any other ones that my colleagues may mention. Why? Because there is institutional process of discussion around it. Somehow Chinese peace plan didn't gather 5 task forces. They were not getting suggestions and proposals from everybody. Somehow South African peace plan was killed during the day of the visit of the leaders of African countries. You know, they've come with a peace plan, and Russians launched missiles against the cities where their visits were planned. And it was quite symbolic, like, right, they've come to Ukraine with a peace plan and there are missiles in the air. Well, they could at least not to frame their partners, they could organize silence to, you know, to masquerade it at least, but Russian chauvinism has no limits. And again, the peace plan that was tried to be promoted by some other third parties, they are all generalized things without institutional background. This is what Ukrainian peace plan can boast, and the summit is the confirmation of that institutional work done by Ukrainian diplomacy within the last year and a half at least. This is why Ukrainian peace plan has good chances of implementation, and we have to understand that diplomacy only will never become a way to solve all of the problems. So here diplomacy is of aid to the armed forces, and on the opposite side, the armed forces of Ukraine reinforce the diplomatic work of Ukrainian state. So this is what we can see about the connection with the Statute of the United Nations. Also, talking about implementation, we have to understand another important factor, that the West has to finally change their approaches. You know, they make half a step ahead and then they think, okay, so what do the Russians do? But Russians never think like what the West thinks when they were doing those acts of sabotage, or when they threatened the Western capitals. And when the journalists and like all the journalist investigations demonstrate, you know, Russians were preparing for the war against the whole Europe. Those acts of sabotage in the ammunition storage in Czech Republic, they were all the links of the chain of aggressive actions against both Ukraine and other European countries. And you know, probably we don't see a lot from that information that is being made public, but one way or another, these, you know, when NATO recognizes Russia as the direct threat, like Mr. Borrell, the European Union, they call Russia as a threat to the European security. Representatives of intelligence of different European countries, they talk about the necessity of militarizing their society in the view of the Russian threat, but still they take Russia into account, and this peace plan will relieve them from this necessity to take Russia into account. And this Ukrainian peace plan, it contains a mechanism for holding all of the perpetrators accountable for crimes against Ukraine and Ukrainian people, and it's very good as a part of a sanction policy. Now we promote this idea that the frozen assets should be handed over to Ukraine, and now everybody is waiting for the legal mechanism whether the income from those frozen assets will be handed over to Ukraine or the whole assets. And sometimes the European policymakers make us surprised. For them, it's impossible to hand over these funds without taking into account the electoral sentiment in their society. Well, but again, we understand that no matter the toxicity of Russians, the lobbyists still continue working. They have their chains built, and after investigation of Politico, they've called all of the diplomatic representative offices of Russia in Europe as a branches of KGB or FSB now. So it's going to be an important question to be discussed during the summit in Switzerland. There is a political will by the political leaders of EU. They've described already 4 mechanisms on how to hand over those funds to Ukraine, and Switzerland summit will just expedite the process of handing over the Russian assets for the needs of Ukraine. And for an umpteenth time, it proves that the peace plan was not drawn out of the blue, and it's not a result of our wishful thinking. It's built in the context of realistic things and political solutions that are quite mature with our partners. Thank you. Gentlemen, you've mentioned that other countries try to take part in promoting their business plans, like China, global south countries. Well, in your opinion, what could be their role in the final peace agreements, and what is their potential generally? Well, in our study, it exists, by the way. We mention it a lot. We have dedicated section, and when we were analyzing the information, well, really, now my colleagues have mentioned it, that there is in fact one plan, Ukrainian peace formula. All other initiatives, it's difficult, to accept them as plans, because only behind Ukrainian peace formula there is the real international law and the United Nations statute, because the declarative appeal to the territorial integrity and state sovereignty is contained in all of the more or less formalized plans. We're not only talking about those plans that were not formalized. We're talking about South African, Chinese plan, and other initiatives, including so-called Brazil initiative, Trump's plan, which we don't know for sure exists or not. It's like a Schrödinger cat. There is Indian assessment, and we don't know whether this plan has any relation to Trump, by the way. So yeah, there's a lot of things that are being thrown into the information space, but really the African plan and Chinese plan, well, they all start with the words of respect to the national security, but as it says in the word, you will know them by their acts. And this Chinese plan, when it was announced on the 23rd of February 2023, People's Republic of China did not accept it as plan, as a serious document. First of all, they were talking about communique. Well, this is what it was called. So they had to just work that act. It says that there was no readiness to such reaction. 1 year after the beginning of the big war, it turned out that if you're a big country, you're supposed to react in some way. And obviously it was done. But you know, there is quite an illustrative part of it. Apart from declarative nature that has nothing in common with the foundation on which Ukrainian peace plan is based, because our plan is really elaborate and the influence positions are established, that there are task forces in GD, in Denmark, Malta, at least 3 big task forces about which we can talk safely. And it's not about the end of the war in Ukraine, but about the world becoming a more just, fair and safe place. Why are we interested about it? I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. Like last week I had a conversation with one of the advisors of the president on one of the Baltic countries, and they really count on certain breakthrough. They will take part on the highest level, and in my opinion that's quite illustrative too. So on top of everything, those plans, they are relatively, so to say, egoistic. And even the Chinese peace plan, the PRC, it has 3 articles that can be equalized with the African peace plan, because the African peace plan boils down to like stop the war because we don't have grain and it may result in famine on our end. So this is what it was looking like. And what's interesting, Ukraine was able to change the sentiment of African leaders. 6 leaders that were visiting Ukraine during that visit, including probably because of the attitude of Russian Federation, who resorted to launching another missile strike against Ukraine on that day. And one of the key persons on this plan is the president of South African Republic. He said, like during the summit with Russia, he said, like, we don't want any gifts from Russian Federation, we just want the Black Sea corridor to operate properly. So the Chinese peace plan, to a certain extent, looks like that African one, because there are 3 articles which are childish and egoistic in my opinion. Like, China is ready to undertake obligations on rebuilding Ukraine. Another thing is like we have to preserve the trade and production chains, like the confidence that everybody is interested in them as a workshop of the global workshop, like we're going to make things here. And another word about the Black Sea corridor, because China is yet another consumer of both Ukrainian and Russian grain. This is why that plan, it doesn't even look integral. You know, it's just a set of provisions. First, it's the ritual goal without which no one is going to talk to you in a decent society like a United Nations. Like, look, we respect the sovereignty. Then Chinese diplomacy keeps talking about the Ukrainian crisis. This is what they call it. This is exactly what I mean by you will know them by their acts. And on top of that, there are provisions in which China once again reminds them of their aspiration to become a global leader. They call everybody to refrain from the expansion of military blocs. They do not call NATO directly, but they just call it military blocs. And they call everybody to refrain from the use of nuclear arms. It's like against Ukraine, but it's not really about, because Russia is the only part of the conflict that possesses nuclear weapons. But Russia, the point is that China is afraid that other countries may become in possession of the nuclear arms. And for China, who wants to become a hegemon, it's very important. But let's not focus too much on Chinese and African peace plans. We may talk and analyze a lot of things here, even talking about the Brazil initiatives. Both presidents were coming up with them, but eventually it all ended with Brazil's suggestions being very remote from real life circumstances. We live during the times in which we may see this distortion in the world, the perception of the world. You know, the African plan is built in a way that based on those colonial trauma, like everybody owes them. Like you white people reconcile it real quick to make sure that the Black Sea corridor to supply the grain continues operating. That's one thing. China is clearly view everything through the communistic dogma. Well, there might be a lot of disputes about their communistic nature, but they completely overlook the necessity to adhere to some specific normal things, and they try to maintain their hegemony. And Brazil, who is completely out of Western and European context, they come up with suggestions, but they are mature enough to become a global force. So those proposals look like something like, okay, so give up Crimea and everything's going to be all right. So it's again quite illustrative. And all in all, the analysis of all those initiatives that we are currently observing, we can also mention that India is, you know, such a force that they, as if they exist, but they say like, you try to solve it on your own, but they do not evaluate it as a war, you know, what's going on in Ukraine. So practically all those plans are not plans at all. And on top of that, the implementation of any one of them would mean continuation of the war, first of all, weakening of global democracy, because it's a camouflaged call for capitulation of Ukraine. That goes without saying. And key problem, in my opinion, is that basically the authors of those initiatives, they quite frequently do not expect the way the Ukrainian peace formula was promoted. For example, like Mr. Valentyn has said for the PRC, the global summit, whether they want it or not, it's important for them. China proclaims themselves as the voice of a global South, and now there's a number of global South countries attending, and China will not be present there. Well, it's diplomatically said a little bit illogical, but their presence would mean recognition of the meaning, of the profound meaning of this conference. So, you know, I think that in any case what we're seeing, that Ukrainian peace formula presented by President Zelensky, it completely changed the agenda. And regardless the fact that the Russians would continue coming up with this idea, like there are other proposals that need to be considered, well, it may only work as information noise, as a provocation. Probably they would want to do something to undermine those initiatives. Well, they continue doing it, but I don't know whether they will be able to make it. I think that in on a historic scale, it's difficult to say so. Historic scale is difficult to say so. Thank you very much, dear journalists. If we have any questions on the floor, please raise your hands and ask them. Fakti editorial, Oleshchuk. Mr. Petro, do we understand it correctly that the presentation of the plan was taken plan in the summer last year? Well, it was proclaimed during the summer, and it was proclaimed as a plan with all provisions during the G19 summit in November 2022. But why does it take so long to review this plan? Why wasn't it started to be discussed like in a couple of months after its presentation? Why did it take so long to organize this peace summit? Well, it's a classic diplomatic work to get as much support as possible from other countries. So technically saying, this peace plan could be discussed in the United Nations General Assembly and it could be buried there, just like during the Security Council. So this is why we've decided to resort to such a complicated mechanism, so it survives and it continues supporting the interests of Ukraine, to make sure that the most countries possible support it. And again, there was a principal position on part of the United States that we have to engage as much countries as possible, the representatives of the global south. That's the conditional term, you know, but it's very difficult to convince them. If you remember, within the last 2 years, Ukrainian diplomacy has expanded their visits of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Africa, Latin America. They were not just regular business trips. We were meeting with a lot of countries to discuss our position, to communicate our position, and we have some good progress here. Who would have thought that Ukraine will have such an ardent partner as Argentina, or that we would be able to change our positions in Africa, or to make African countries act more cautious towards Russian Federation? That's a very complicated process, and the diplomatic process of agreement upon the text that we have to do with 80 different countries. It's a long process. So it's not like it took so long because we don't know how to work. It's quite the opposite. We know how to work. This is why it takes so long. And in continuation of my question, those 5 task forces in Malta, Denmark, and other countries, do they work on agreement of this plan? Yes, it's the coordination thing. This is what I was talking about, the potential of a Ukrainian peace plan, that its discussion provided it with the institutional capacity. You know, it's not like everybody nods their heads and leaves doing their own thing. More than 80 countries are involved in support of the provisions of the peace plan, and they help us in promoting every single article of it. Well, probably it would be interesting for the spectators what exactly is discussed by those task forces. Well, talking generally, is the future world order, the rules under which the world is supposed to solve all the war and peace issues, and the final statements that the countries are ready to support. So basically, if you approve the finalized text after all of the discussions, hand over $300 billion of the frozen assets, or all of the frozen assets, in favor of Ukraine. So the jurisdictions of those countries who sign under this, they will start implementing it. So that's the new agreement. for implementation of which we need all of this work to be done. So it's theoretically saying, but what will the final text look like? Yes, thank you, Mr. Valentyn. You wanted to add something? Yeah, I would like to rephrase it a little bit in the opposite direction. So to say, you may ask it in a way, why was it decided to hold this summit without achieving agreements with all of the states? Well, it's clear, the answer is clear, because convincing those who are still not convinced means postponing the approval of the finalized document. So it's about the balance between the desirable result and the efforts which are necessary to be taken to achieve this result. So I think it was quite a correct decision. It's better to get the support of a sufficient number, but what number is sufficient again? Like 80, 83, or 160, or 161? Well, you understand what I'm talking about. So in this context, what Zelensky has mentioned, like, stop producing more and more plans. Let's stop at something realistic. Let it be Ukrainian peace plan, because like otherwise we could say, okay, who had not yet expressed themselves on this topic? Like, every country can task their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like, okay, draw us some plan. I think in this studio we may play and say, okay, you will be Nepal, for example, and we still don't have Nepalese peace plan, and then Ukraine has to convince Nepal about that. Well, I'm taking Nepal just arbitrarily. There's no discrimination about this statement, but we have to understand that, like, it's not about the perfectionist aspirations. Like, we need to get a tool using which we can achieve an important goal, and the goal is clear. It's a fair and just peace. Not peace, but a just and fair peace. And the foundations of fair peace are not described in the plan, but they're behind this plan. It's restoration of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, bringing perpetrators to accountability for crimes against humanity, the compensation of inflicted damage and losses, guarantees of security, everything that is behind that peace plan, the cornerstone, so to say, and whether this plan will be allowing us to implement all those provisions. Another question, Roman Kucharuk, Information Agency Nation. I have a couple of questions. Well, but at least please answer one of them. The first question is whether there is the political fate of Yermak will change upon the results of the summit. Then will the absence of agreement on protection of a beetroot influence the absence of China? And can you offer something as for the Ukrainian authorities so they get out of this trap of legitimacy? Well, not all of the questions are relevant to the topic of this press conference, well, specifically about the beetroot. Well, I think not everybody can analyze the conclusions of the summit. We don't even know the list of all of the participants. I think that closer to the beginning of the summit, we may be surprised by some of the participants. You know, now that there is certain degree of suspense. There is like a Mexican standoff when everybody is trying to keep the looking other party in the eye, so it's a little bit premature to discuss the conclusions of the summit, because again, probably the adherents of the beetroot may come up with some surprises to the global diplomacy here. I think that this is how can I comment this situation. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions to our guests? Thank you. Lyudmila Olinik, Maidan Media. I'm curious, as a result of today's discussion, today's presentation of the peace plan, the partners of Media Maidan are curious about the following. Does this plan take into account the will and the fate of Ukrainian people? Because really the country, Ukraine is a country with 1,000 years of history, and other countries keep close track of the rule of law in Ukraine. So is it taken into account? Again, that's the first part of my question. And another, are you aware, and does your study take into account that Ukrainian people was excluded from economic activity of the state of Ukraine, and Maidan Media has such a suspicion? Did you study this issue? Are you aware about any discussions in the Ukrainian academia based on which we could come to a conclusion and to start preparing seriously to such planetary scale events in Ukraine and in other parts of the world? Well, there is the principle of national sovereignty, and the only source of power is the people. But the people in this context is demos, democracy, the rule of the people. And there were other words in Greek language that meant people. For example, ethos, but we don't say ethocracy, we call it democracy. We discern between political nation, and when we talk about the sovereignty, state sovereignty, it's about the sovereignty of demos, the people of Ukraine. But we have to understand that this right, the existence of the people's sovereignty, is implemented through the right of the people to establish representative bodies, and through this representation the government, the agencies, the authorities are being built on behalf of the people, and they are accountable in front of the people, and people may change those institutions under the way contemplated by the law, and even under the way not contemplated by the law. So when we say whether these provisions ensure something for the people of Ukraine, yes, of course it is, because we talk about the state sovereignty. State sovereignty is the capability of the state to identify its internal and foreign policy on their own. So that's all envisaged by the UN Charter. It's about your first question. And talking about your second question, well, yes, the people are the owner of the natural resources of Ukraine. But what does it mean? It means that the rent for use of the natural resources is being then handed over to the national budget of your state budget of Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can start digging for nickel in your courtyard. Well, we can recall this story that was forgotten during the war, when Zelensky was proposing to establish this foundation for future generations. Yeah, like when the rent that was paid for use of the natural resources could be handed over to that fund, but it's like putting it out of the state budget to a dedicated fund. Well, it basically, honestly, I'm a philosophist by education, In terms of politology, I think we should mention the mechanisms of legal documentation, and just to give everything to everybody, like the land. The land is the property of the people. I tend to think that when the land has owners, those owners are representatives of the Ukrainian people. But this idea of making everything public, in the year 1991 we gave the clear answer to everything, that we want to be private owners of our land. Well, let me add just a couple of words that one way or another all these discussions are still pending for Ukraine, but to make them productive we need to have Ukraine preserve its sovereignty, to make sure that without the state sovereignty there can be no people's sovereignty. It's a fact, and this is what we're talking about here. And all of the questions related to organization of life in Ukraine, in Ukrainian state sovereignty, justice of redistribution of the resources, they will continue being topical, because those are issues related to democracy. And if we talk about democracy, the rule of people means a lot of aspects related to social justice. Thank you. I would like to thank our guest. Thank you. Well, let me remind you, we were talking about the Ukrainian peace plan as a basis for preserving the global world order. Ukraine Media Center is putting together the schedule for the following days. Stay tuned. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.